Eric. Thank you so much for joining today. How are you
Absolutely.
today?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I'm doing really well. So thank you so much for agreeing to join us. I know you've always been such a champion for RPA, especially for your university, colleagues and folks that are really trying to figure out how to modernize, the education system, especially in the higher education world, where lots of technologies have been, in need of updating, right? And several different ways of doing things have to be culturally adopted before change can be made. So since you've always been such a champion, we always lean on you for kind of a check-in. So thank you for being that expert. So Eric,
Absolutely.
how long has just the basics for folks that haven't followed your journey, how long have you guys had an RPA program at VCU?
So it's tough with COVID because we've all lost a couple years. I think we're going on 2.5 years, but it might be a little bit longer than that now. I just don't remember. But we are starting to grow into a more developed program. We got through our proof of concept phase fairly quickly at the height of COVID. And so we were starting our first development as everyone went home and, we got into lockdown mode. It was a really interesting process, and we were really glad to kind of already have something in place to work on. So we've learned a lot since then. We've shared a lot since then. And, I really have enjoyed the process. We've learned so much, and I hope that I can share a few tidbits with you today.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate that. So, I always like the storytelling way of going about things, right? I think it's relatable for folks that are in your shoes, and I think it's applicable to folks even outside of the education industry. So I'm really excited about your insight. So a lot of people ask me, and I always, I do have an answer, but it's better coming from you. When you're considering how to start, what is it that makes for a great place to begin your use cases when you're considering a digital transformation using automation? What is important to consider in what you're looking to automate, that whole process, and how do you pick the technology that you wind up going with? Can you talk us through that beginning phase? I think a lot of people get stalled or struggle, and there's kind of a surefire way to approach it.
Absolutely. And I think I'd almost expect you to get hung up at this point. And we were at the same place when we first saw RPA, and we're like, oh, it's so cool. Like, we've got to do this, right? There was no question that it was something we were interested in. But then, okay, how do you actually go about picking the right process? And I think before you do that, you kind of have to do a little bit more due diligence. You've got to talk to more people. You've got to understand what's been successful for others and what hasn't been successful for others. And so we did that. And at the same time, we were learning about what software we might want to work with, what partners we might want to work with. And so we just asked a lot of questions, and we sponged it all up. And from that, what we learned was that it makes sense to pick a process that's kind of simple. You don't want to pick one that's too complex to begin with. If you're doing it all yourself, it really makes sense that that you think about what you're going to get hung up on. And so you want to get the scope of your proof of concept down to a manageable piece. And we certainly chose to choose some support from WonderBotz when we got started. And I can't imagine trying to do it on our own. Just the governance, the infrastructure, the licensing. And so we were able to lean heavily on WonderBotz in order to get started. And I think the great thing about how you guys helped us is that you can kind of support in a lot of different ways, right? So you can do robot development, you can do side-by-side development, you can do more training, you can do the infrastructure work. And so like the right size approach really helped us. In terms of the process itself and like what you should do in order to get started, the first thing is you really need to identify the size, the scope, and the funding for your program. And you don't want to undershoot or overshoot, right? So if you're just learning about the software, it doesn't make sense to go in and throw everything at it all at once. You kind of want to see how the first process goes, and then you can kind of reevaluate and say, okay, this part was great. We need to spend a little bit more time and effort in this other area over there. Set a time commitment too, right? So, it's going to take a little bit of time to do your first process. So you want to say like, okay, after the first 3 months or after the first 6 months, we need to reevaluate and say like, yes, this thing is awesome. We need support in these particular functional areas in order to get these processes automated. but also it helps you identify like what level you need to go to that next level. So can you do 2 automations at once? Do you need to focus on one? Can you do 3 or more at once? Or do you really need to take a slower approach? So during that time, you can also work on RPA development training. You can't expect that somebody can just pick this up in a matter of weeks and be a professional developer. It takes a little bit of time and knowing how to work with your functional software. And that's another place where I think we really appreciated the third-party support, because you guys have done this a lot and you've done it with a lot of different types of clients. So you're able to really help us in that fashion get started and then use the expertise that you already had in order to kind of figure out what we needed to be successful with that first project. So just to summarize, getting started, talk to people, ask a lot of questions, and make sure you pick the right process, something that's not too overly complex, doesn't try to talk to 12 different systems. Pick something that you can get your hands around first. And the other thing that was really great for us is that we used something that we could build on. So we took pieces from that first process that we are now able to then use for our subsequent processes.
That's so helpful. And I think that sets the table, and something that you alluded to that WonderBotz definitely made sure to instill on you guys early on is that design thinking, right? That when you're thinking through your development, it's so important to have reusability in mind so that you're making sure that you're going to get a lot of bang for that development buck, right? And whether it's you doing it in-house or having a partner, it still costs money to develop and to build those.
If you build it that way from the beginning, it just makes your life easier forever. So
yeah. Can you say that one more time?
If you think about what you're going to need in the future and compartmentalize it, I'll give you a great example, a technical example. Before we ever really started building the process, one thing that we were hung up on was how can the robot log in? And we have a single sign-on system. And so what we identified is that, okay, if we're prompted for the single sign-on, then the robot can sign in. And if we're not, it's okay. And so the robot can deal with it, but it doesn't have to. And that was the piece that we really struggled with. We since then now have that same piece in each of the robots that we build, right? So if the robot has to log in, it knows how to do that. And we don't have to go and recreate that code every time because we built it and we are able to reuse that same piece that was built, which each and every robot. So we don't have to recreate the wheel.
No, I think that's a superstar trick that most people don't learn until about year 3, 4, 5, more mature programs. So you guys definitely got a great head start on that. So in talking about getting started, that's the first hurdle, right? And then the next hurdle is kind of this group that I just alluded to, the 3 to 5 years. We're talking about how many more licenses we're going to have. Typically, a license term has come to an end. At that point, you're justifying whether you're going to renew, whether you're going to add to, whether you're going to take advantage of the new tools. So as a COE leader, and looking at what you guys are going to do and making recommendations to the business, when is it that you consider either other technologies or, scaling or, doing 2, developments at the same time rather, with the same department? So when is it that you start thinking about scaling and what factors go into that decision-making?
I think you need to have that in the back of your head as soon as you get started. And you probably need to think about it every step of the way, right? Because as things progress and as your RPA program develops, I think the first part is developing a plan, right? So where do you want to get to? Where do you want to be after a few years into the program? Ideally, you're going to have multiple robots running and some different structure there to maintain them, whether it's functional or more technical, a full-blown COE, or some combination thereof. And so there's a lot of questions you'll need to ask yourself and to answer along the way. We sort of did a lot of that work up front. And I can go into a little bit more detail there, but just in terms of scaling, you've really got to evaluate what works for you and your business, right? So us as a higher ed institution, we're very lean, we're centralized, and even though we're centralized, we're somewhat siloed. So the finance organization operates relatively independently from a lot of the other organizations, like say human resources or student success. And so we operate almost as little businesses, right? And so even though we've got this capability and we can share it with these other groups, we've got to we are intent on automating the things that we know are problem children for us first, at the same time sharing with our partners across the university, hey, this is what we've been up to, because we know it can help in a lot of different areas. So other questions that I think you need to think about as you're scaling, and again, I mentioned we sort of worked on this heavily up front, was addressing governance. It's something that we were very concerned about from the beginning, just because it was a newer technology to VCU when we started launching it. We wanted to make sure that we had a governance plan, and we leaned on WonderBotz to help develop that. But really, what we've learned since then, I think, makes a lot of sense. So I just had a few points that I wanted to make here to talk about that. As we scaled our program, we wanted to treat every robot like a human in terms of security. So every robot has its own account in our systems. Every robot has its own password in our systems. And so you then have to think about how are you going to store and maintain and share those passwords across developers or across the functional teams. So you need a plan for that. It's also critical that you forge a partnership between your functional teams, meaning finance for us or whatever your business is, and the infrastructure and IT teams, because they're the ones that are either maintaining your virtual machines or creating your security classes. It's also absolutely essential to have IT security buy-in. So we met with them in a great deal to make sure that they were comfortable. They were relieved to see the security used by Orchestrator in the cloud. And so we know that because it's got, a robust framework built behind it, it's used by a lot of different industries, they felt confident and had no concerns about it. But we just wanted to make sure that we were hand in hand with them every step of the way in getting these accounts first created. Something else that I think happens in year 2, year 3, and further out is how do you prepare for an audit? So how do you document the development of an RPA robot and the operation of your RPA robots in terms of creating these accounts, restoring passwords, fixing issues, documenting what's happening? If you think about a human, if they make a mistake and it becomes an audit issue, the audit's going to want to see a log or what happened. How did that user have access to be able to do that? It'd be the same thing for a robot. So audit is going to become very important for any institution that becomes a more mature RPA program. And so we sort of started out with that in the forefront of our mind and planned for that, going forward. So you want to document how you're creating your accounts, how you're setting up your VMs, your virtual machines, and then how you're managing the volume. So a lot of different issues there. I think every RPA program probably has dealt with scaling in different ways. And there's a lot of good ideas out there in terms of tools that you can use to scale. It really depends on your institution or your business and where you're going to get to. Someone that's running 5 robots needs something different than somebody who's got 500, right? So the size of the COE is definitely going to change accordingly. And I think it's okay if your scaling plan can kind of morph over time, right? Right now, we've got about 4 robots in production, another 2 or 3 in development. And so as we get to the 10 robot mark, I think we're going to start to need a little bit more help to make sure that everything's, tested on a regular basis. Everything is running in a fine-tuned way. And that's when your COE really starts to need its foundation.
No, and I agree. And I think you said a couple of points that a lot of folks starting off don't think about, right? And again, it's organization size independent, and folks might want to go the self-sustaining route where they're looking to build the capability in-house and find more Erics, that have multiple roles and multiple BAs. In a federated type of way. That could be one route for VCU. But the other route too is, again, saying, we don't want to build this capability. We recognize these as digital workers that are integrated into our environment, and maybe we don't want to take on the controlling and the maintaining of these robots internally. We just want to feed the process, that needs to be automated, right? So there's several different ways to go about it. But the point is that you don't have to have the people puzzle figured out until a couple years in, until you start figuring out sort of where you're going to spend your time and what kind of resources you have in-house, right?
It also depends on the quality of the robots that you build, right? So if your robots are relatively robust and don't need a lot of care and feeding, that was my biggest concern when we started our RPA journey was, I don't know if I can maintain them forever, right? As we grow and grow and grow, one person can't maintain all these robots by themselves.
Right.
And so we want to build the most robust robot possible, because we want to be able to make sure that it doesn't need constant attention. It can live and it can alert the functional team when there's an issue, and hopefully the functional team can resolve it or call for help, or, whatever needs to be done.
Yeah, no. And I think the word there too is resilient, right? If you build those robots for resilience, then an upgrade isn't going to phase it. It's going to be an alert, and the maintenance of the bot's going to be pretty understandable to anybody kind of stepping in if you kind of have that SOP in place.
Sure.
So fantastic. I think that's super helpful. One of the things I wanted to ask you too, is as you kind of, evangelize this. So we talked about some of the places where it's good to start and, hitting up the ones that you guys know are great candidates for multiple reasons. Even if it's just that nobody wants to do the work, there's multiple reasons that something should be automated, right? Expanding into those other areas, as you said, evangelizing, which hopefully videos like this is why we do this, is to kind of help people understand what it is that we do in these different departments. But as you're starting to think through different little businesses, as you called them, your peers in other spaces of the university, how is it that you go about explaining what makes sense? Is this an educational, is it something to educate them on? Or are there candidates that you kind of bring forward that you've brainstormed, that you give suggestively? How would you suggest somebody, kind of bridging that gap of having an intake process, if you will, of automatable candidates to kind of see if they make sense for the business to automate?
Sure. There's a lot of different ways where you can manage your automation requests. And I think that the way that worked for us at first was to go out and solicit ideas from your functional support. So what areas do you all think are painful, right? Let's make a list of the worst processes we have, and then we can, refine that a little bit more to figure out, okay, I think we can help with automation in these areas. The other ones, maybe they're too complex, at least at the beginning, or maybe they're dependent on other processes. So soliciting the people that are actually in there working in the systems every day and that are feeling the pain. So I do this every day for 4 hours and it's very repetitive. Well, that's a really good candidate for automation. I think you asked a little bit more about how do you then go and share that with other groups. And so a lot of the processes are interconnected, right? So payments that are made by a central place maybe are coming from different departments. And so we need to think about it from a big picture perspective. Something you often hear folks talk about, and it's really important, is that you need to really understand your business process before you go and try to automate it. Is it tuned? Is it, the ideal process? Are there other things you can do to simplify the process outside of automation? If you can kind of fix those things, as we've looked at processes, we've gone to try to automate several processes and found huge gaps where no one knows why we do it. It doesn't provide any value. There's no output that's needed. It's very repetitive, and we're doing it because that's the way they were trained to do it. That's the way that it was written down in the manual, and that's the way they've always done it, right?
That's the way they've always done it. You read my mind.
It's just kind of silly, but we can cut some of our process time almost in half if we just think about it. Why are we doing this? And do we need that? Are there other ways that we can simplify it? And then if you're able to add RPA on top of that, you can then free up those folks' time to go and do more critical thinking, more problem solving, customer service, those things that we really struggle to have time for, and really getting down and dirty with their data. So that's something I want to speak about a little bit, but maybe we can talk about when we're discussing a little bit more about, how we measure the success of our RPA program. In terms of managing the automation requests, develop a master list, things that, you don't have time to automate everything, put it on the list, because you're going to reshuffle things around. Okay, it may not make sense to do that one now. Let's move something else forward. You always want to have a big plate to choose from. And that way you can kind of slice and dice. Okay, well, that team may not be ready for us functionally because they're working on another implementation, but we can move something else up.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that hits nicely on the benefits realization because, in order for you to educate on what's automatable, that's one thing. But to your point, it could be that a few process improvement tweaks makes this not worth it. So why would you spend the development time and money on something that maybe could just be improved, right? And so that's part of that education sequence there. So what would you say to somebody to help them see what makes for a valuable or potentially valuable candidate? Are there parameters that you guys typically look for that are different? Have you come up with any tricks along the way that kind of like a gut check or anything that you could share with anybody that helps you decide on top of the metrics?
One of the most important questions is the process going to be changing anytime soon? We've gone through some development and then realized, oh, wait, now that we've developed this great robot, it does exactly what we wanted, we need to change the process. So if you think about that and have a good conversation about that at the beginning, I think that's really important. Any sort of time-consuming process is the number one thing that we're going to look at. And it could be time-consuming because it's painful or repetitive. There's a lot of, different things. Because we're a higher ed institution, saving money is not our number one goal. It's never been from the beginning. There's just not enough ways for us to capture that return on investment. So we're looking for other things. There's a lot of different things that we can use to kind of validate our RPA success. Employee morale and retention is very high on our list, right? So if somebody spends 2 hours a day doing the same thing, and now they don't have to do that anymore, they spend 20 minutes looking at a report and validating it, they're going to feel much better about the robot, right? So getting them on board from the beginning was really important for us too. And I would highly encourage anybody starting with an RPA initiative to kind of get out in front of it to make sure that your institution, your business knows why you're going forward with this plan. So it's always been more than people and dollars for us. Cost avoidance is a huge one. That's probably our number one besides employee morale and retention. So if we can use a robot to help without having to hire additional folks, that's really important for us. We've seen a lot of growth in certain research areas at our institution. And so in support of that, we've spent a lot of time, effort, and investment really in our automation of our research areas. So repurposing talent is something that needs to kind of come hand in hand there. As you build robots in certain areas, you're going to have some folks that maybe need additional training, and they can now evaluate data quality and accuracy instead of repetitious typing. And so it's really about empowering them to work with their data, to help them with their productivity, and making citizen data scientists. So this is across the board in every functional area that we support, and we support payroll and grants and treasury and the financial reporting, all those different areas. There are now folks that are working with automation in each of those areas, and they're all becoming experts in their data, right? Before they were just typing it into the system, but now they really know the quality of their data, and they can spot errors and they can identify problems. And so it's training them to be a little bit more technical, but also having them help to own the automations that we're building together.
Well, and I think there is a convergence at a certain point in your maturity where the beneficiary and the folks that are providing the RPA service, if you will, or managing that, need to come together to have a joint, goal. So I think high turnover would be a great place to kind of peruse to see if there's potential there. In addition to high volume and the usual automations, but that's a great point. Other clients are looking for places where they can help, check the box of compliance. You mentioned audit, making sure that you can add and subtract there, using the levers of the robot. A digital worker doesn't make mistakes. There's a log that gives you a breadcrumb trail of everything that was performed and logged into. So I think it's important to see those areas. So in kind of wrapping up, so I think that sort of gives us the beginnings and the middles, and kind of some of the success stories would be sort of the end. And I think it's really important for the morale of an automation program. And I've seen this across the board with huge COEs internally, folks that federate it, folks that, use us for training because they're actually going to hire internally, a multitude of different roads to success here. But ultimately, it's important to celebrate the successes, And so I'd love for you to tell us, I know you've shared a couple of the use cases that have done, a remarkable job, but if you could share one of your success stories and why it was the right candidate to pick, one of the automations that you built, what it was able to give back, and, and what you've done to sort of socialize that success and get some more, fanfare behind the automation program at VCU.
Sure. We've had, I would say, a lot of success with our robots, and each robot has become more complex. The one that I want to speak about now is our most complex robot to date. We just put it in production a few weeks ago, and it took us a fair amount of time with development, but it was really because we had a lot of trouble with testing it. We got a very difficult set of test data where it's really payroll for the whole university. And so given certain scenarios, the robot is analyzing how to process it and dealing with errors. So it's something that happens every day. And the robot now goes in, it's able to read from our ERP database. So that was the biggest step for this robot, that the connection there and being able to work with the database in a much faster method than querying the visual display on the screen. And so by working hand in hand with both the database and the ERP software, it's able to flow through this process and to execute it manually and to resolve any errors so that our payroll can be processed in a timely fashion. So something that the number of errors changes every day, but it's really related to our grants and whether or not the period of performance has ended on those grants. Given certain scenarios, we're able to reopen them. And so because of that, now we're able to think about how that same thought process can be used for other robots. So we're applying it to at least two other processes, kind of bigger picture, taking a step back. That process happens in the middle. There's two other things that happen that are sort of associated with it, right? So there's something that happens before where the payroll is getting processed and trying to associate that payroll being processed with different charges. And then there's something on the end that associates it with another grant as well. So this process is able to just get our feet wet technically in terms of working with the database. And we've had a ton of success. I think we're still socializing that one out to our functional groups and making sure that they understand how to work with it. But I think what we've learned in that process is a lot of making that process as robust as possible. In dealing with this ERP, it can be a little finicky sometimes. And so we've learned a lot in terms of error checking and in terms of looping and things like that are required in order to make sure that has the robot done what we asked it to do, or did the ERP run into some sort of little hiccup, right? And so, like you said, the ERP doesn't really, or the robot doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't, but our ERP does all the time. And so we've got to be able to handle those and be able to work with those. So we're super excited about this robot. Again, it took a lot of testing in order to get us to the point where we were ready to roll it out. But from here, I think the sky's the limit in terms of what we're going to be able to do with accessing the database and then being able to use that for subsequent processes. So very cool stuff.
That's so cool.
We can start to call APIs in our ERP. And I think at that point, watch out. Every institution is going to want this. So.
Yeah, what a showstopper. I can't wait to see the true unveiling. We're going to have to segment that because, that is a pretty, I guess it isn't just resilient. In your world, they are robust robots. Those guys are pretty powerful. And then imagine if we had a few AI models and see sort of what happens through machine learning over time and get even better. So thank you so much. I think that wraps us up for kind of understanding the beginning, middle, and an end. Is there anything that you throw out to somebody, if you would have known the advice, that you now know, what would be the one nugget that you would have given to Eric at the beginning of his RPA journey?
I think that's a really great question. I would encourage you to make sure you pick the right process first. I feel like we did, and we've been nothing but successful because of it. If you don't pick the right process first, I think it's going to be really tough for you to get the program started in the right way. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to come up with multiple processes at first, and then do, some pros and cons for each one of those about why they would make the right first process. You need to think about which team is going to be right functionally to be able to support this. And so not everybody can get their head around how to develop a robot. If they're used to just using the financial software or whatever they use every day, they may not understand what's required in order to feed a robot information for it to be able to process. So take your time and don't be afraid to ask for help.
I think that's great. Well, thank you so much.